Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So a point that comes up in the comments under many of my videos, and comes up relatively frequently actually, I would say maybe as much as 30 or 40% of the videos I upload, at some point this point is raised by a commenter underneath my videos, is the question of the value of swords compared to other weapons. And here I'm going to compare with the poleaxe, which with the warhammer, which I have noticed has already been dubbed warhammer, which I approve of greatly. So the question of the value of swords versus warhammers or maces or axes, and a lot of people, I don't know exactly why, are under the assumption, I suppose, that a common soldier would not have very much money and therefore would be more likely to be able to afford a warhammer or a mace rather than a sword. Well, first of all, were swords more expensive than warhammers, maces and axes? Well, they could be, but they weren't always. So, as I've said in the past, I've done a fair amount of research into the value of medieval arms and armour, particularly in England, from English sources, including wills, coroners' reports, other kinds of court cases, where they mention the value of weapons. And it's very clear that by the 14th or 15th century, swords, whilst they could be hugely expensive, and I cite the most expensive sword that I'm aware of from the medieval period that we have a value for, Henry V of Agincourt fame, actually ordered 12 swords to be made in Toledo for him, and they were valued at £2,000 each, and that's just like an inconceivably huge amount of money in medieval terms. You can probably build a large building or a small castle or something like that for £2,000. It's hugely expensive. So it's like comparing to like a Bugatti Veyron or something today. Or perhaps even a couple of Bugatti Veyrons. So yes, swords could be hugely expensive. However, they could be massively cheap as well. And I found reference to many swords that were obviously second-hand. But remember, swords weren't only produced new and then when a person died or retired, thrown away and ceased to exist in the world. There were second-hand swords, there were old swords, there were rusty swords. Even broken swords were made into knives and daggers. So swords were continuously being made, and therefore there were greater and greater numbers of swords in circulation. So the relative value of them came down, and of course as an individual sword got resharpened and maybe got a bit old, maybe it got some notches in the blade, maybe it got a bit discoloured from rust and then it got cleaned up and it didn't look very good anymore, it wasn't worth very much. And I found the cheapest sword that I found, I believe it was in a coroner's report, so where they're describing a weapon that was used in the murder of someone and they value the weapon, and the sword was valued at 1d, which is 1 pence. 1 penny. Now to put that into context, an English archer, for example, was paid, if they were a foot archer, they were paid 3 pence a day. So aside from their living costs, food and boarding and such like, and feeding their horse if they've got one, they could, theoretically, buy 3 swords, 3 crap swords, 3 old swords, every day of their military service. So an archer is pretty much the lowest paid soldier in a medieval English army at that time. There were in fact mounted archers in the English army. That wasn't that they shot from horseback, but they were like dragoons. They were quick moving troops that could ride somewhere, dismount and then shoot on foot. So deploy very quickly around the battlefield, and then they could mount their horse again and move somewhere else on the battlefield. And they were paid, I believe, up to 6 pence a day. So 6 pence a day for an archer, and you can find swords in the records valued as little as 1 or 2 or 3 pence. Okay? So yes, swords perhaps sometimes were more expensive than warhammers, because of course they're more difficult to make and they've got better quality steel in them and so on and so forth. But they were still, relatively speaking, cheap. Okay, so anybody who was a soldier, certainly in any kind of professional army, I'm not necessarily saying like town militias and stuff like this, and maybe if you're looking at levied troops who are forced into service, possibly, yes, they would have agricultural tools used as weapons and large sticks and mauls and hammers and, you know, tools basically. Yes, that is true. You might have peasant militia. However, by and large, professional soldiers, all of them could afford many, many swords if they wanted them, and if their sword broke, they'd buy a new one. Or, you know, if they just fancied a new sword, they could throw one away or sell it for 2p and buy a new one for 5p. It wasn't a problem, they could all afford them. Now, this is the next kind of what I consider an interesting point. I don't know if you'll consider it an interesting point. Whilst a sword on average might be a little bit more expensive than a warhammer or axe or mace, remember that all soldiers basically could afford a sword anyway. In actual fact, the mace or warhammer, if you think about what it is, it's a specialised armoured fighting weapon. Okay, so who wears armour? It's the rich guys. So ironically, contrary to what lots of people out there who comment on my videos seem to believe, that, oh, if you're a lower class, then you probably have a warhammer rather than a sword. No, wrong. If you were a lower class soldier, you'd almost certainly have a sword. Why? Because a sword is more effective if you're fighting out of armour and your opponents are fighting out of armour. This is the most effective weapon to use if you're something like an archer. It's easy to wear. Most of your opponents are going to be other archers or billmen or stuff like this, so this is the most effective sidearm against them. A mace isn't very effective because look how short it is. Yes, obviously I can hit someone in the head with the mace, but I have to get very close to do it. And if I do hit them in the shoulder with this, it's not going to do anything like as much damage as hitting them in the shoulder with a sharp sword. Okay, so in actual fact, the sword, whilst many of you think it's a noble weapon, was carried by all soldiers in the medieval, certainly in the late medieval period, was carried by all soldiers as a sidearm. This was only really carried, or the warhammer was only really carried, or wallhammer as we now call it, was only really carried by the really rich guys in armour, because that's really the only real use for these weapons, is to fight against other armoured guys, where you're in armour, so you don't need to worry about how short your weapon is, because if someone's hitting you with swords, you can charge in on them. Okay, you can take the hits on your armour, it doesn't matter. You've got a mace, so the shorter length doesn't matter, and then the percussive force means if you're fighting other guys in armour, you can smash them in the helmet, you can smash them in the knees, you can smash them in the elbows. You can really mess up their armour and their ability to fight in it, even if you're just badly bruising them or potentially giving them fractures, but, you know, basically putting them out of action. These are weapons for fighting in armour. They're not very good out of armour. This is better in light armour or out of armour. So in actual fact, it's the complete opposite. The lower class soldiers would have this as a sidearm. The rich guys in armour would have this and this as sidearms. Okay, cheers guys.